We've got a college football playoff matchup coming up on Saturday that few could have anticipated a few months ago. Penn State hosting SMU, ACC and the Big Ten getting together. We got Steve Helwick on the line from Hustle Belt and Underdog Dynasty. Catch his work there at SB Nation. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm doing excellent. Bowl season started yesterday with that Western Michigan, South Alabama game. Always love the pageantry of Army, Navy too. So it was still a good weekend, even with two FBS college football games. But looking forward to bowl season this week, and then just seeing how we navigate this 12-team playoff. What are these atmospheres like at these home campuses? I'm kind of excited to see what this first ever edition of this expanded playoffs like.
And you're going to be on location there in Happy Valley to check it all out. First, the Frisco Bowl. So Steve is going to be at the Frisco Bowl on Tuesday night. So check out his work on SB Nation. Then right there on hand in Happy Valley. Have you been to Beaver Stadium before?
Yes, I've been. Beaver Stadium is what got me into college football. My parents were Penn State alums. I grew up going to those games at Penn State on fall Saturdays, going to whiteouts. So this will be the first whiteout I've been to since 2007, as Penn State officially designated as a whiteout. And I can just tell you that atmosphere, that's always going to be a help for Penn State. You look at their whiteout history ever since Penn State really arrived on the scene under James Franklin in 2016. They've only lost one whiteout game. It was by 1 point. And recently they've dominated those games to a overwhelming extent. So that atmosphere is going to be hard for any team in the country to overcome.
And we know what the weather can be, and that's certainly been a hyped portion of this CFP analysis of going on campus with these games in December is teams from the South traveling to the North. Maybe a little too much has been made of it, but you know what the deal is in the state of Pennsylvania in mid to late December. It could be 40 or 45 degrees and it could be fine, or there could be the white stuff in the air and it could be pretty nasty. I've seen some projections of the mid to late high 20s as being an extended forecast for this Saturday.
Yeah, it does get cold in Dallas, Texas, so it's not like this is a completely unfamiliar territory for SMU. But SMU last year in the Fenway Bowl and sub 40-degree temperatures did look a little off. The offense just looked out of sync last year, so that's a learning experience for SMU. They lost that Fenway Bowl to Boston College in kind of gross weather conditions. It was kind of rainy, under 40-degree weather, so the weather is definitely going to play somewhat of a factor in this one too, and SMU just has to be prepared after encountering that brutal Fenway Bowl weather last year.
And Steve, you understand this situation and know where we arrived at this point as well as anyone in SMU and Alabama as a comparison, where SMU certainly didn't suffer the losses Alabama did. It's a pretty clean resume in regards to very understandable losses against a BYU team that finished 10-2, losing by 3 points when at a point in the season, obviously, before Kevin Jennings emerged as the starting quarterback, and then you lose on a 56-yard field goal in which SMU dominated the fourth quarter against Clemson. Maybe the wins aren't on the high end. I would say Duke, Louisville obviously come to mind as big wins, a couple 9-3 and 8-4 teams, TCU as well. So what are your thoughts about SMU's ability to maybe overcome what some people think is a talent deficit?
I don't think there's too much of a talent deficit. And when you do look at SMU's two losses this year, which I was on hand for both of them, both by 3 points, and both of those losses, I would argue that they outplayed the other team by quite a bit. That was definitely the case in that BYU game. That game, I think SMU got inside the 35-yard line 8 times and never came out with a touchdown. They were just burdened by turnovers, just burdened by the offense just couldn't move upon reaching the red zone in that game. And BYU won 18-15 despite SMU seemingly outplaying them the whole game. Same thing happened against Clemson. SMU dug itself in a hole. They never trailed by more than 11 all year, and that was in week 0 when they trailed by double digits. But they were down 14-0 in roughly 4 minutes into that Clemson game. They had personal fouls, they had turnovers, and they just continued to shoot themselves in the foot, trailing 24-7 at halftime. But the way they dug out of that showed the SMU team that we knew all year long. So I do think that SMU has proven it's been able to compete and be able to beat every single opponent that's been on its schedule so far. So I'm not sure if I'm too concerned with the Mustangs about a talent deficit. Yes, they're the underdogs going into this game. Yes, they're in a hostile environment. But SMU is pretty balanced in almost all position groups. They stop the run as good as almost anyone in the country. Offensively, they have so much tremendous balance. Good at running the ball, good at passing the ball. And SMU just, I think the balance that they bring to almost all position groups, they play good defense, they play good offense. I think that they can compete on this stage without any issue.
Steve Helwick joining us from SB Nation's Hustle Belt and Underdog Dynasty. We lean on Steve quite a bit for the Group of Five matchups. And of course, SMU just emerging from the Group of Five. But then, Steve, with everything concerning college football, you hear the background of going to Beaver Stadium. So this is a perfect fit for this conversation. Of course, Rhett Lashley, one of the brightest offensive minds in college football as we stay on that side of the ball. From the Gus Malzahn coaching tree, worked with Sonny Dykes, of course, at SMU before he went to Miami. And then Kevin Jennings, a lot of us not necessarily aware or just assuming that Preston Stone was the guy leading into this season and didn't really realize how close this quarterback competition was. And of course, Preston Stone led this team to an undefeated record in conference play last year. And again, 28 touchdowns, 6 picks as the assumed leader, but obviously it was a close competition. And once Stone faltered against BYU, then Kevin Jennings has obviously taken over and never looked back.
Yeah, that was a very surprising. I was shocked going into the year when Rhett Lashley kept saying it was an open quarterback competition. Preston Stone and Kevin Jennings both deserve starting reps. So yeah, the first 3 games they were doing Preston Stone starts the first 2 drives, Kevin Jennings starts the first 2 drives, then Preston Stone comes back in, and then after that 5th drive, then they settle on a quarterback the rest of the game. They did Stone for the Nevada game in week 0, and then they settled on Jennings for that BYU game in week 2. I was surprised how close it was because Stone was an excellent All-AAC QB last year. It led them to that 10-2 record before his broken fibula. And Kevin Jennings, while he won the AAC championship, I didn't think it was really a quarterback-dominated game. I thought SMU's defense was the one that really asserted its dominance on Tulane that evening. But with Kevin Jennings, he really opens up a lot more of what SMU wants to do on offense. They kind of run a spread offense, a lot of power run game that they rely on. And Kevin Jennings helps keep that run game more honest as somebody that has more mobility and more athleticism about the pocket. Helps because SMU wants to run a lot of RPOs. Kevin Jennings is better at that. And also he helps avoid sacks. There was that BYU game where I think Preston Stone only played 3 possessions in that game, took 3 sacks. Kevin Jennings, he's only taken, I believe, 11 all season. So Kevin Jennings, he kind of has that additional mobility that SMU wants to operate with on the offense. And it's worked pretty well this year. And Kevin Jennings throws a pretty good deep ball too. And one thing that I kind of admire about his game the most is his poise. That crowd last week in Charlotte was probably 65 to 70% Clemson fans. There were 4 third downs. Not only did they have to erase a 17-point deficit under him, but there were 4 third downs on that final tying touchdown drive. And Kevin Jennings helped convert all 4 of those third downs right behind a crowd that was backing Clemson pretty heavily. So there was a lot of noise there. So unflappable quarterback. I think he's done a pretty good job of handling things for most of the season. He'll have a few moments of just errors, like early in that game with a strip sack, unaware TJ Parker was coming off the edge. That Duke game where SMU coughed up the ball 3 times on its final 3 possessions of regulation. So if you can limit those errors, Jennings has been a pretty good quarterback for the most part.
Of course, Steve, SMU in a situation where if they simply recruit the area, it's almost like the University of Houston, then they'll be in good shape. Of course, Rhett Lashley's only been there for now a second full recruiting cycle, but he has recruited Dallas well, but he's basically brought over the Miami football team to a certain extent. There are so many transfers. And the one that stands out, obviously, as we stay on the offensive side, is converted wide receiver Rashard Smith, who was a pretty decent player at Miami, but has really found his home from the tailback position. 1,200 yards, 14 touchdowns, 4 receiving touchdowns. He's obviously been a huge find.
Yeah, he's super fast. You can see that in his wide receiver background, and he's really good at just hitting the hole with explosive speed. Averages about 6 yards a carry. First team all ACC running back in his first year with the Mustangs, 14 touchdowns, almost 1,300 yards in the year. And he was a big part of that comeback against Clemson, just keeping the run game pretty honest to allow Kevin Jennings to do what he does through the air. So yeah, SMU didn't really have a number one tailback last year. It was more of a running back by committee approach, but Brashard Smith has really changed that this year and has been such a crucial component of the offense. And he's also second on the team in receptions. Good check down option for SMU, keeping their options versatile in the receiving game. So yeah, Brashard Smith's done a pretty good job this year. And you mentioned a lot of those Miami transfers. That defensive line too has a couple of them. Elijah Roberts, he's a big one there, forces a lot of pressures. SMU actually leads the country in quarterback pressures forced, and Elijah Roberts, a defensive end, huge part of that, had 1.5 sacks against Clemson last week. So yeah, Rhett Lashley using his previous connections pretty well. Jafari Harvey's another guy on that defensive line with 12 tackles for loss, 7 sacks in that game. I guess it was a game-winning field goal block against Duke, which even allowed SMU to be here in the first place. Because if Duke hits that 30-yard field goal, SMU is probably not getting that conversation over Alabama. So yeah, these Miami guys and these Dallas area transfers, they have worked wonders for building SMU back into a power.
Yeah, Jared Harrison Hunt, obviously another guy along the defensive front with 6 sacks. Staying with the offense, Steve. So the wide receivers, Roderick Daniels is a threat. You notice that the yards per reception are high for most of those guys. Kevin Jennings likes to move it downfield and obviously hit the deep balls. They had one of the best tight ends in the nation, R.J. Maryland, go down about halfway through the season. Matthew Hibner's been a capable backup, and he was obviously playing anyway. Just your thoughts about the wide receiver core, what threats they pose, and then getting to the offensive line, obviously against one of the better defensive fronts and front sevens in college football.
Yeah, the SMU wide receiver core is kind of the antithesis of Penn State's, because Penn State is just their receiving game is just so overwhelmingly dominated by Tyler Warren and just one incredible talent that they have there. SMU is just there's not somebody on this receiving core that's all ACC or somebody that you see as a first or second round pick, but there are so many talented receivers throughout this group, and a lot of them they're pretty interchangeable, where a lot of them are capable of doing the same things. They'll send a lot of them on fly routes, get deep balls to them. Roderick Daniels Jr., Keyshawn Smith, they're the only 2 guys over 500 on the team. Nobody's over 600 yards. Those guys you'll see the most on deep balls. You were mentioning the yards per catch are pretty high on the team. So yeah, they do like to target downfield quite often. Not a team that really tries to win through the screen game as much. But yeah, Matthew Hibner, he's another tight end, a good established downfield presence. Losing RJ Maryland was tough. RJ Maryland, they don't win that Nevada game week 0 without RJ Maryland just scorching earth in that fourth quarter on that final possession. But when you look at Matthew Hibner, last week he just made an incredible grab in the corner of the end zone to really fuel that fourth quarter comeback, get it to 31-21, and get SMU starting to believe that they can come back down 17 in a single quarter time frame. So yeah, there are a lot of options Penn State must key on in this game, because there's not really a number one guy in this offense, but it's just a slew of guys. And they also just returned Romello Brinson, who hadn't played since the TCU game. He came back against Clemson. So that adds even more depth to a receiving core. Even though they're without RJ Maryland, Jake Bailey, they're still like 6, 7, 8 guys deep in terms of targets that they rely on.
Brinson, of course, another Miami product. They're at wide receiver for Rhett Lashley. Back to the defense, and there is sometimes an assumption, especially when somebody elevates from the group of 5 level, that if they're able to compete at this level, it's going to be speed, it's going to be scheme, it's going to be some trickery there. But on the defensive side, as you had alluded to, they got 15 interceptions. That's a top 15 figure in college football. They're 9th actually in yards per play given up defensively. So the defensive ranking is 28th in total defense. But if you look at the yards per play, it's a top 10 defense. So they have played extremely well. And after those first couple drives against Clemson, obviously performed extremely well.
Yeah, you look at SMU for years, from I'd say the mid 2010s until 2022. SMU had elite offenses every single year. The only thing that this program was missing was an assertive defense. And that was what Rhett Lashley made a priority. He hired Scott Simons, who they just extended earlier this week. He was a defensive coordinator at Liberty. Scott Simons really helped change the trajectory of this defense. In 2023, they got a lot of transfers, a lot of defensive transfers, and over half the starting lineup were defensive transfers, and that really helped rework the defense. Simons helped organize all the moving parts, get them in one place. And this SMU defense, it's very controlled by the front. The front seven does so much for this defense. I said earlier, they lead the country in quarterback pressures. They don't have a single guy with more than 7 sacks, but it's a really concerted effort that they have across the entire defensive line. And that pressure prevented Clemson from being able to do anything offensively in the second half pretty much last week. So, yeah, I think the pressure is a lot of what the defense does really well. And also they defend the run excellently. Clemson couldn't get much going on the ground. And if you look at SMU's run defense, they're third in the country in fewest yards allowed per carry at 2.7. They're fourth in the country in fewest rushing yards allowed per game at 93. So teams aren't able to establish a run on SMU. So you really have to beat them through the air a lot of times. And when you're trying to beat them through the air, that pressure is going to be there. So you need to get some quick passes off, and you need to win those one-on-one matchups in space on the boundary with your wide receivers if you want to beat this SMU team. But yeah, tremendous job of just reworking the defense is what SMU's done the past few years. And you mentioned all those stats, and that's why they're in the playoff right now, because we've always known what this program was capable of offensively. But they got some guys, and they got some size up front.
Yeah, when you really grind it down, and you made the statement a few minutes ago that you're not necessarily expecting a huge talent gap to be evident in this game. Of course, it's in Happy Valley. That's one of the better home field advantages in college football. It's a 6-11 matchup. We would expect Penn State. Vegas is tabbed them as an 8.5-point favorite, but you're not seeing a talent gap. In looking at either team, do you think there's a decided advantage anywhere that either team can take advantage of?
Yes, I would say another thing that I'd cite from that Clemson SMU game was the best player on the field of that Clemson SMU game was undoubtedly Clemson's defensive end, TJ Parker. Penn State has their own TJ Parker, and it's even a better pass rusher than TJ Parker, and that's Abdul Carter, defensive end, 20 tackles for loss, 10 sacks this year. You see him coming off that edge, just flying with incredible speed. Going to be playing on Sundays very soon. So I think that matchup of Penn State's defensive line against SMU's offensive line, SMU's offensive line has been pretty good this year. I said Kevin Jennings hasn't taken too much sacks, but it's just the pressure early in the game. SMU, I said they like to go deep. They like these routes to develop. If Abdul Carter and that Penn State defensive line can kind of prevent any of that from happening, that's one area where Penn State can gain a really good advantage. And they need to do it early on. SMU is a team that needs to see a 7-0 in its favor on the scoreboard. When SMU's offense is stalled early, it's kind of snowballed throughout the season. There's 3 examples of that, and that was the Nevada game in week 0, the BYU game in week 2, and then the Clemson game in the ACC championship, where SMU started slow, and then it kind of just kept on unraveling in the second and third quarters before they really caught on to something in the fourth quarter. So SMU really needs a fast start in this game, and there can't be any learning curve for its offensive line when blocking Abdul Carter. They need to figure that out from the get-go, and that is a huge point of emphasis SMU needs in this game.
Folks, please like the video, subscribe right here at the Voice of College Football. And again, Steve's going to be on the road this week at the Frisco Bowl, and then he will be on hand for this one in Happy Valley, the 6-11 matchup, Penn State and SMU. Steve, appreciate you being here, dropping the knowledge as always.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.